world tonight. This is Grant Cameron, and you're listening to the Cameron Files. Tonight I want to discuss a little bit about a lecture I'll be giving this coming Saturday morning in Los Angeles, and it has to do with contact modalities. I have a couple of events happening at the same time. I have a book that's coming out very shortly, which will probably get the vast majority of the attention, and it's another book on disclosure. It'll be called Beyond Managing Magic, the government release with ATIP, stuff like this. But I have some new material that I'm going to add, which I think people will be talking about at least for a couple of days. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a much more important subject. We'll get a lot less attention. I'll be giving this lecture at the Consciousness Life Expo in Los Angeles at the Airport Hilton, and there probably won't be that many people listening to it, but it will be live streamed. But I will be doing a later presentation, maybe in a workshop environment, and then on YouTube. So you will see the extended version of this. What I'm going to do tonight is just sort of give an overview of contact modalities, why I say this is the most important subject that we need to be discussing. And I've been saying this since 2012 when I had my download experience. Basically said this is non-local consciousness. This is the basis of this whole UFO mystery. You need to understand this. In 2013, I gave a lecture in Sebring, Florida on consciousness. And at that lecture, Ray Hernandez, who was one of the co-founder of the Free Foundation, came to that lecture because he believed that consciousness was also involved. And he came to hear my lecture. That was the first UFO conference he'd ever been to. He and his wife basically told their story in the morning experiencer session. A couple of days later, Ray had an experience on the Miami freeway, stuck in traffic, where he experienced an out-of-body experience, where he was basically taken from his body, and he was in an environment where he was looking at images of like a wheel moving around, these images. In each of the sort of the spokes of this wheel were different things like quantum physics, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, UFOs, and at the center of this rotating sort of image was consciousness. And basically he was given a message that he was to get this out, to relate to people that all these things are the same thing, that you're parsing this kind of stuff. All these different paranormal phenomena are all related, and they're all linked to the middle of the wheel, which was consciousness. And Ray called this contact modalities. He said there are these various contact modalities. Now, I had come to the same conclusion going down a separate route. I had written a book called Inspired: The Paranormal World of Creativity, where I looked at a whole bunch of different aspects. I would look at musicians, artists, savants, psychedelics, UFO experiencers, abductees, and I looked at all these different sort of paranormal things where people were able to do things that they shouldn't be able to do in their ordinary life, do massive calculations in their head, or they were getting messages from whether they were channeling or they were mediums or whatever. And I came to the same conclusion that it was all linked. So both of us went down separate routes and we came to the same conclusion. So Ray had asked me to do an article for the book 2 of the Free Foundation on contact modalities. And I really sometimes don't really get working on articles that well. And so I decided that what I would do is I would actually go and I would put down all the different contact modalities, and then maybe that would inspire me to just sort of put the book together. I figured I would probably have maybe 12 or 18 of these sort of like spokes of the wheel, and that I would go from there. When I started to list them, I came up with over 70 contact modalities. And when I started looking at them, I realized that the connection was even more clear than I had first imagined, that this stuff is all basically the same thing. So that's why I'm going to sort of give you an introduction tonight to talk about these contact modalities, which I'll be talking about at the Consciousness Life Expo next Saturday morning. But to link it into a book that's just come out, Diane Pasulka has just released a book called American Cosmic. And in there, she talks about Tyler D., who has now been sort of, well, I guess he's been sort of outed for a couple of weeks, but now it's pretty public that his name was Tim Taylor, and he was an engineer with NASA. And I actually had a couple of encounters, and I won't really get into those encounters tonight. It will be in my new book, my encounters with him and what he told me. And he basically, the reason that he and I had a conversation was basically to talk about this consciousness connection and the fact that you need to look at experiencers. Now, this is something that's been a division in the UFO community for, I guess, since I had my experience, maybe before, is that there's two different fields. There's the field where people believe that we need nuts and bolts, we need rational, analytical, left brain thinking, we need to measure, we need to photograph, we need to have all this kind of stuff, and that's how we're going to discover the UFO solution. And after I had my experience, I firmly came to the conclusion that we had been spending 70 years on this, and we had basically wasted 70 years, and that you are not going to, if you're going to look at metals, which is a big thing now, to look at different types of metamaterials, or if you're going to look at videos, which were released with the ATIP story by the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico, or if you're to look at UFO sightings, the most you can get, and I maintain that absolutely the most you can get from this is to determine that, yes, something very weird is going on. You are not going to be able to tell who this phenomena is, where they're from, how they fly the craft by looking at videos or by picking up pieces of metal, little tiny pieces of metal that in a large part are just dropped by these UFO crafts. So Tim and I both had the same idea, and that's what I had one conversation with him at a cottage in Pennsylvania. And what we discussed at that point was this whole idea about a contact modality dealing with UFO experiencers. And I maintain that you have to definitely look at UFO experiences, because whereas the government may know what's going on, they will never tell you. There's a group of people that are sort of like these Avery type people, former intelligence military people who have got a background in ufology, who have at some point in their career come up against the UFO problem and are sort of interacting with each other in what J. Allen Hynek used to call the invisible college. And they are also not going to release what they've got. They're working on it, and they're getting patents, and they're working for different contracts and whatever, but they're not going to tell you. The only way I maintain that you are going to get to the bottom of this thing is to talk to the experiencers. Now, the free survey, which was done by Edgar Mitchell and Ray Hernandez and Mary Rodwell and Rudy Shield and a bunch of other people on the board, I believe the number is now over 6,000 experiencers, people who have interacted with the phenomena. Not just seen it, but have actually had some sort of interaction with the phenomena. And when you start to talk to them, they will tell you what's going on. And when you start adding their 500 or 600 questions that they all answered, you start to see some very direct patterns. And this is where you're going to start to understand what's going on. These people are being told material, and they are also very willing to tell you, because they basically are in a situation where everybody's laughed at them, nobody really wants to talk to them. So they will tell you what's going on. Now, that was the common element that Tim and I had, is that I was working with an experience that he was also working with, who was Chris Bledsoe. And the reason that I was interested in Chris Bledsoe and the reason that Tim was interested in Chris Bledsoe is because Chris Bledsoe has a very high level of contact. And so if you want to know what's going on, you see his high level of contact where he's basically like 24/7 tapped into whatever this phenomena is. And you say, if we watch him, we can figure out what's going on. So I was sort of, we talked a little bit about this. And in this cottage event, Chris was actually there. And there was about there was about 5 people. And then there was a psychic that came after Tim had left. But anyway, so Tim and I discussed this whole idea of dealing with experiencers. And he had 2 other experiencers that he was dealing with that he told me about. And one of them he basically mentioned to me was a girl. He said she now living in Florida, but she may have lived near you in Canada. And when he told me where she lived, it was like 35 miles from my city, and I was just fascinated. And he actually got on his cell phone and he said, "Do you want to talk to her?" I said, "Sure." And so he put me in contact with her. And I've talked to her a number of times, and she is a girl who was basically like on the internet 24/7 in terms of getting messages and premonitions. And I sort of tracked some of these premonitions that she was getting, and was very, very accurate. And so, again, Tim was watching her, and then I started watching her and just listening to what she was saying and hoping that somehow by listening to what they're saying, you're going to learn what's going on. Now, in this latest book, Tim actually talks about this connection and the fact that this is what you got to do if you want to figure out the UFO mystery. And he spends a lot of his time doing this. And what he basically points out is that, and he talks about SETI, and he said SETI's doing all the wrong things. Basically, if you want to know, if you want to receive, or if you want to interact, you need to actually deal with human beings. They are the best detector of what's actually going on. They are picking up the phenomena. They are interacting with the phenomena. And so why would you have radio satellites and things like that pointed into outer space when you're getting no signals, when you have people walking around on the ground who are actually interacting? And the other thing that he had talked about, and he had told a friend of mine in greater length than what he had told me, was this idea of DNA. And I can sort of quote from Diana's book. He talks about the fact that human DNA, if you stretch it out, it comes out to about 2 meters long, and it has a frequency of 150 megahertz. So Tim Taylor states that DNA is extremely important. That DNA, as he told my friend, is basically an antenna. It is shaped like an antenna, and that the NASA antennas are built on this principle, and that deep space communication is done at 150 megahertz. So basically, he pointed this out, that human beings are this very rich sort of source of material, that they're tapped into this. They have this communication thing. So that's one of the contact modalities, and that's sort of where I was going, is that you make the assumption that the people that are telling you their contact modalities, that they're in contact with a spirit or an alien or whatever, and you sort of get enough of them together, and you start looking at the neurology of these people, and you start looking at their stories, and you start to realize that these people are actually telling the truth, and that there are actual contact modalities that people have done. And it would be almost like anything else, like music or like sports. And so there'll be some people who are sort of average at their contact modality, and then there's some people who are going to be very, very good. And so when I started to list these things off, I realized that there were a lot of them, and that they were very accurate, and there was very direct neurological things that were happening in the brain that started to explain exactly what was going on. Now, I'll give you sort of the sum total of the story before I start out. What I have come to conclusion, and this will be sort of shown or not shown as I go along, whether people accept this theory, is that basically the brain is a sender-receiver, and it's actually very, very inaccurate. So people will describe, well, the brain is doing this, the brain is doing that, and no, the brain's not doing anything. It comes down to this basic idea of, does consciousness create the brain, or does brain create consciousness? And the more we go along today, the more we realize that it's actually consciousness that's creating the brain. We have epigenetics, things like this. We know that meditation will change structures in the brain, stuff like that. And so when I do this contact modality lecture, what I basically describe the brain, to me, it looks like it's a giant bubble machine. And that if you can, the basic principle is that if you can shut off the bubbles, you can actually tap into reality. And so let me give you a couple of examples. as of a couple hundred years ago, people would say that the world was flat. And you would say, that's the brain tells you that. You can see it's as obvious as the nose on your face that the world is flat. It was not until we suddenly had ships that could actually go out, and then you'd have these people coming back with stories, whether it was fake news or real news, that the world was round, that they had actually not fallen off the edge of the earth. And or later on, we would have astronauts that would go around the earth and take pictures, and we would say, oh, that shows that the world is round, even though if the astronaut took a picture of a UFO, that would not be true. But if he takes a picture of a round earth. So we came to believe that the world was round, but that does not come from the brain. The brain was telling us quite clearly that the world was flat. The same as the brain was telling us quite clearly that the sun went around the earth. It was not until we got in some other material and some analysis we started to realize that this was not true. But that was what the brain was telling us. The same thing is we now know with various other parts of the brain that it's like a bubble machine. It's actually throwing you off. It's actually built to keep you in the physical world, to allow you to exist in the physical world, but that the vast majority of the things that you are perceiving are not really true. Another example, there's a lecture that sometimes I will refer to, Jill Bolte Taylor. Jill Bolte Taylor does a lecture, and she was a neuroanatomist from Harvard University working with brains in the brain lab. And she was working on schizophrenia because her brother was schizophrenic, and she has a left brain hemorrhage. And the left brain is where your rational analytical thought, it's where the ego is, it's where the voice, where language is, and it's what we always talk about in science. We need this left brain thinking type thing. So her left brain was completely shut down. She was having a left brain hemorrhage, and as her brain was shutting down, she describes, as a neurologist, exactly what's happening. And she stated that she suddenly could not determine where she was in time and space, that she couldn't tell where her hands ended and where the rest of the world started and where her hands ended, things like this. And she basically stated very clearly that when the left brain shut down, and it was off for 8 weeks until she had an operation 4 weeks in, and it wasn't until 8 weeks later where any bit of the left brain started to come back online, she stated there was no ego. So ego, no matter what anybody says, does not exist. It is created by the left brain. She stated there was no ego, there was no voice in her head, there was no little person talking in her head. She said it was absolutely wonderful when she had this, even though she was drooling and she was sort of, people had to take care of her, she didn't really know what was going on. She was sort of like in utopia, and she was actually very upset when her brain started to come back, her left brain started to come back online, and suddenly the voice was back. The other thing that Jill Bolte Taylor stated was that when the left brain was shut down, there was no fear. There was absolutely no fear whatsoever. It did not exist. So you can start to see, whether it's the round earth or whether it's the sun or the ego or fear, we assume that the brain is actually giving us correct data as to what's going on. And in fact, it's not. It's like a bubble machine. It's creating this sort of illusion type thing. And when you can shut the bubble machine down, that's when you actually see what reality is. Let me give you another example. We sort of know now that everything is not solid. That everything is at least 99.9999913 times all space. It's all space. But you say, it looks like it's solid. I know it's solid. That's what your brain is telling you. That's what your senses are telling you. That material is solid. And yet we now know it is not solid. It is almost exclusively all space. So that is another incorrect thing that the brain is giving you. It's giving you a false interpretation of what you're actually seeing. Same thing applies to color. We know for a fact there is no color. It's just a frequency. It's a frequency of a wave that goes in through your senses. There is no color. There is no green out there. And yet, when you look at it, you say the brain is telling me that there's green, there's red, there's different types of colors. And the two that I'm going to get into on the contact modalities are the ones with time and space. We now know since Einstein, and the more people are jumping onto this bandwagon as we go along, that time and space are not actual items. They are things that are sort of created. And you will see this with people who have been abducted. the first thing they'll say is that time and space, the space is all messed up. They don't know where they are. They're in sort of another reality. Time ends. There's missing time. Everything seems to slow down. The same as people who have out-of-body experiences. When they have a car crash, they will talk about the fact that suddenly the car is turning and it's like time stops. They have a life review. It seems to take forever, and yet this is only in a matter of 1 or 2 seconds. So time and space are not what they think they are. And we now know with the temporal and parietal lobes that when you can shut these two down, one is in charge of time, one is in charge of space. When you can shut those two down through meditation, through different modalities, when you can shut those two brain sections down, then suddenly you get the oneness experience that Edgar Mitchell talked about, the samadhi experience that people that have psychedelic experiences will talk about. The fact that even though things are all, you see separate things, but you realize that they're all one, they're all connected. And that is when you get this brain centers that are shut down, which means that we have an illusion of time and space. And when you can shut off the brain center that is causing that illusion, turning off the bubble machine, then you see what reality actually is, that time and space are not parts of real reality. They are just things that the brain is telling us that allow us to exist in the physical world. And the last one I'll mention is one that may be still disputed by people, but the fact is that nothing is moving, that your senses are picking up image, 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 and you're rolling the images one after another, that it's not a moving situation where your brain is picking up separate images and running them, and when you run them, it's like a film in a movie theater that you think it's moving, and it's not. It's just a series of still images are being put together one after another. So this is the whole deal, and this is the basis of contact modality. And we have now some research that's being done by Gary Nolan and Kit Green, and they're getting into neurology, and that's good that we're going to get into neurology of looking at experiencers. So at least they are in the position where they are looking at experiencers and believing that we should look at them. We should look to see if there's anything unique about experiencers. And, they did their analysis, and they're looking into about the, I guess they call it the caudate putamen section of the brain, where the structure has been changed. It's different. It's sort of heavier in the connections in that section in people who are experiencers. So what they're doing is they're taking UFO experiencers. I think they have 105 people, maybe not in, because that's the injury, the people who have got injuries, but I'm not sure how many. I know that they are looking at experiencers, and they're trying to get experiencers to describe to them what they're experiencing, how this works, and doing this brain scan on them. And so they have this section, and what I say is that yes, this is going to be part of the experiencer brain imaging, but it doesn't explain it. This is going back to trying to say that there's a section of the brain that causes you to be psychic, and that it's linked to genes, and that if we can figure out which gene the aliens are messing with, then we can create a drug, and we can stop the evil aliens from messing with us and make them go away. And I say that this is, I guess the term that is sometimes used is false association, is this is going to be part of the whole program of how the brain taps into non-local consciousness, but the brain is not creating consciousness. It's the other way around. So you have a situation where the analogy would be you have a forest fire in Northern California, and it's a big fire, and there's 1,100 firefighters there, and there's a lot of smoke, and there's a lot of heat. But that doesn't mean that the 1,100 forest fires caused the fire. It doesn't mean that the smoke caused the fire, and it doesn't mean that the heat caused the fire. It just means that, yes, those things are part of the association. And the example that I can use is Kit Green, who's working on this thing where they've got this section of the brain associated with psychic phenomena. This will be part of it. But about 10 years ago, he was working on another experiment where they were working with a guy from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and it was there where they had they were looking at research that had been done at Laurentian University in Canada by Dr. Michael, not his name is Michael Shermer, and Shermer had come to the idea that the right parahippocampal gyrus was lighting up when they were psychic people, and they were actually working with Ingo Swann, and that they stated that every time that Ingo Swann would hit a target, this section of the brain would light up, and they showed that it's even more complex than that, which is what I would say, that probably every section of the brain is going to be involved in psychic phenomena, and it's going to be very, very complex, because one of the key things that was found at Laurentian University and has been found in other places is this association with the Schumann's resonance, that there's a resonance in the Earth's atmosphere, which I think is 7.81, and they determined that when Ingo Swann was hitting his target, that his brain was at 7.81. It was in Schumann's resonance. And that connects with another type of contact modality, which is called rapid image cycling. Now, rapid image cycling is a process that's used in what's known as the Cadillac of all energy healings, which is known as the Bengston method. Now, William Bengston, who was a sociologist, had worked on this based on what he was told by a psychic, and this psychic could do this healing. And their technique, they say, if you haven't had radiation or chemotherapy, they can basically cure any type of cancer. And the worse the cancer is, the more accurate, the faster they can do it. And they've done it in mouse models at such a rate that they had to actually keep the healer out of the building. If the healer knew where the mice were, the mice would all get healed. It was very, very dramatic sort of process that they're using. And what they would use in that process, which was known as rapid image cycling. And what they would do is, and I actually trained for this, that you would take 20 ego images that would appeal to the ego, to the left brain. And what the idea was is to shut the left brain down. So what you're doing is you're giving these ego images, and the person memorizes them, and you start to flip these images in your head. And what they were able to do is train people to flip 1,000 or 2,000 images a second in your head. And it sounds like totally impossible, but let me absolutely assure you, I know how they do it, and I know what the process is, and that this can be done. So they would do this, and what it basically does is it sends the ego for coffee. It shuts down the rational analytical side of the brain, the same as Jill Bolte Taylor talked about having her sort of a samadhi experience when her left brain was shut down. You shut that part of the brain down, and you're able to tap into the field. You're able to shut off the bubble machine, go into the field, and as William Bengston said, get the healer out of the way and allow the energy to flow through. So this is called rapid image cycling. Now, the connection to this research that was done at Laurentian University is that Bengston, it was found that Bengston was at 7.81. He was at Schumann's resonance when the healing took place, and it was actually a sort of a triple harmonic. It would be at 7.81, 15, and 22. So he would be 1, 2, 3 of Schumann's resonance. And that when the healing was taking place, they would do the brain scan of Bengston, and they would do the brain scan of the person who was being healed, and they would both sync up their brain, and they would both have this triple resonance, the triple harmonic of Schumann's resonance. And they show the brain scans identical, that they would go into this as the healing took place, they would both link up, which linked up to the research that was being done at Laurentian University. So Laurentian University, they were working with a guy by the name of Sean Harabin. Now, he's actually now just been interviewed by my friend Maureen Seberg at Psychology Today. He's still around, and he's the type of guy who has a contact modality where he can read a person. He can sit down with you, and he can basically tell everything about you just by looking at your photograph. He doesn't really need to know anything, and he has been studied extensively, especially at Laurentian University. And what they found as well that when Harabantz was on target, when he was hitting targets, he was at Schumann's resonance as well. So you can see it's not just simply this idea that if we can find this little section of the brain, this little section of the brain is causing people to be psychic. It is much more complex than that. And it has to do with frequencies. It has to do with shutting down brain sections rather than activating brain sections. That when you shut it down, you actually open up situations like with the Bankston healing, where you can actually allow the brain to get out of the way, the left brain to get out of the way, and allow this to happen. So in 2013, when I started to work on this, I came up to the idea that it was left brain, right brain. And I remember I was very sort of thrilled by this because I'd looked at all the different modalities. At that time, I had maybe a dozen, and I was looking at savants and musicians and artists and people under hypnosis and out-of-body experiences and all these different things, and it was all seemed to be the same thing, that it was this ability to shut down the ego mind and allow the right brain, the sort of the female brain or the intuitive brain, to tap into the field of non-local consciousness and do whatever magical trick it was doing, whether it was reading people's background or healing people or predicting the future or whatever. And so I remember contacting Hal Puthoff, because Hal Puthoff, they had done remote viewing. And I'd actually looked at remote viewing too. And remote viewing was pretty clear in terms of remote viewing that they had, Hal Puthoff's wife had actually picked up on this, that when they were looking at the results of remote viewers, she basically stated that it appeared that this was right brain, left brain. That what the remote viewer was picking up very clearly was the shape of the object, the texture of the object, the smell,